I'm not a big fan of animal prisons. I mean, zoos. A lot of the arguments you'll hear for zoos are education, awareness. But today, as we face the sixth great extinction, preventing animals from going extinct has become a more popular justification for zoos. To which I say, so what? To what end? What is the point of an animal continuing to exist if you've taken away the true essence of the animal? Purpose. This is a recurring theme for me, purpose. And if an animal exists just so that we can check off a box and say, hey, look, technically it's not gone, we prevented the extinction, it's really not much better than if you had a painting of it, a monument, video archive, holograms for kids to go and look at, like looking at dinosaurs. The animal, for the very purpose that it existed on the planet, the ecological role that it fulfilled, the reason God created it, or the reason that Mother Nature created it, is gone. And the animal in the zoo is prevented from fulfilling its ecological role, from pursuing its instincts. You have prevented that animal from being what that animal is. If you remove the wildness of the animal, to me, you've removed the animal. It is now nothing more than something for entertainment purposes for humans to go and look at. Today, I welcome back author, ecologist George Wuerthner, who wrote a piece that asks the question, would you rather have wild bison or hatchery bison? George, this was a very thorough piece that you wrote, and I have a lot of questions. I want to start by asking about your use of the word hatchery. When you said hatchery, I was wondering if you actually meant mass producing and farming bison, or if you're just talking about they are genetically being depleted to the point to where they just don't have any wildness left in them, and therefore they're now farm animals.
That's closer to what I mean. There's about 500,000 bison. Most of them are just, managed just like cattle on a ranch. So they're, the breeding is manipulated just like it is in cattle. They're vaccinated against certain diseases. They're fed in the wintertime, so they're not being shaped by evolutionary forces like, a harsh winter, which is what over time has made them hardier, of course, because the weaker animals are eliminated. So that's what's happening. And really, there's no bison herds in the lower 48 states that I would say are free of being manipulated to some degree. Yellowstone is the least manipulated, but it's still, because of the way that they're treated, in terms of management, they're still losing some of their wildness.
I opened up by talking about what's the point of the existence of an animal. And when I moved out here many, many years ago, I remember someone telling me about how amazing it was that they had bison roaming through Golden Gate Park. And then I went to see it, and they were just these sad, miserable animals in a fence. And I'm like, this is terrible. This isn't what I was picturing.
Right.
And, it sounds like that's the direction that the existence of bison is heading in general, if something isn't changed.
And the unfortunate thing is that there are alternatives that would help to mitigate that trend, at least among some of the bison herds that we have or could create, in terms of establishing some new herds in large expanses of public land.
I think you listed voluntary retirement of grazing as one of those possibilities.
Yes. Yeah. Should I explain that?
Well, maybe explain why, because I'm imagining that there's a nice incentive involved. Is it just the stubbornness or resistance of giving up a way of life, or what's the biggest reason that people aren't buying into this voluntary grazing retirement?
Well, you have to look at who is and isn't. Individual ranchers, a lot of them are interested in the voluntary grazing retirement, and basically what it would do is somebody would pay a rancher so much money per unit of grass that they're allotted on public lands. And by the way, grazing on the public lands is not a right, it's a privilege. But because of the political power of the livestock community, as you know from point raise, it's very difficult to get federal agencies and state agencies that are managing grazing on public lands to manage them for the benefit of all citizens and for wildlife and ecosystem processes. So this voluntary permit thing has been proposed, and individual ranchers like it, but the ranching, or you might say the livestock industry, doesn't. So the reason is, I think, is that they see a depletion in ranchers on public lands at some point, that they will lose their political power, and then they will, obviously be forced to give up grazing on public lands in some places when there's conflicts.
Wow. So this comes down to political power.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And it, because, the interesting thing I see is that, the percentage of ranchers who are grazing on public lands is actually pretty small. And the majority of livestock in the West is raised on private lands. Yet the private land ranchers generally support or oppose, I should say, permit buyout, because they see it as sort of an attack on livestock industry in general. So there's that sort of, I'm a rancher and my lifestyle is at risk.
I kind of just jumped right into this. Maybe we need to back up. And what was the main point that you hope that readers would have taken away from that publication?
Well, I got this idea of about hatcheries. If you know something about fisheries in the West, most fish biologists will tell you that hatchery fish are less able to survive in the wild, that the selection factors at hatchery favors fish that are not going to be sustainable if they weren't in a hatchery situation. And so we have domesticated a lot of fish, of the fish population with hatcheries. And that same thing is happening with bison, in that in a sense, you can say, bison that are raised on a ranch where they're fenced in and they're moved from pasture to pasture, and the rancher decides which, bull gets to breed with the females and things like that, is just like a hatchery operation, except with a big animal we call the bison. And nearly all of the bison herds in the West are managed that way to one degree or another. And the few exceptions are like Yellowstone area, the Henry Mountains in Utah, and a few other, bison herds around the West. And even the ones in Yellowstone, because of the situation there where the state of Montana, I have to give you the background on that. The state of Montana, years ago, was worried that bison from Yellowstone would transmit a disease called brucellosis to cattle. And brucellosis causes cattle, females, to abort their first calf. Later calves, they don't abort, but it's generally they'll lose a calf, a good chance, if they get brucellosis. And so the ranching industry has tried for decades to try to get rid of brucellosis. And now it's only found in a very small area around Yellowstone Park in wild animals, including bison and elk. And so what happened was the state of Montana said, we don't want any bison to come out of Yellowstone Park onto Montana territory because it might transmit brucellosis to the local cattle industry. And so starting a long time ago, back in the 1980s and 90s, they started to restrict bison from the park in multiple ways. One is they would capture them near the park boundary, and they would just slaughter them and send the meat, to poor people, mostly tribal nations. They would capture some, and they kept some in quarantine for a couple of years until they showed that they didn't have brucellosis, and then they would transfer those bison to basically other tribes, usually. And in some cases, private individuals who raised them until they could be transferred, like Ted Turner. And And then the third alternative is they got shot as soon as they left the park boundaries. And then starting in the about 2005 or six, somewhere in there, um, a number of different tribes started claiming that they had the right by treaty to kill bison when they come out of Yellowstone Park. And and the number of tribes involved in that has grown year after year. And last winter, for example, well over 1,000 bison were killed by tribal hunters right on the boundary of Yellowstone Park. And when you consider that mortality, along with some of the capture and slaughter that occurred and so forth, when you put all that together, about 44% of the northern herd of the Yellowstone bison were killed last winter. And that's a big number. And it also has numerous effects on the evolution of the animals. An example is one of the real traits that bison have that's sort of part of their evolutionary history is mobility. That's how they survived for years, like on the Great Plains, because some parts of the plains might be drought. So you have to move. And bison were good at moving. They have their whole, they have like a fulcrum, the highest point in their body is their shoulders, and they can canter and canter for miles and miles without a lot of energy loss. And that's one of their evolutionary traits for survival. Also, just running away from predators was another trait. And so the bison are designed to be mobile, but as soon as they come out of Yellowstone Park, in other words, the animals that are most likely to migrate are the ones that are getting eliminated. And so animals that stay in the park that don't move much aren't getting killed. So you're taking that mobility thing, that trait out of the gene pool by selective factors like that. And when the other problem is almost all the bison herds in the, like in Yellowstone and so forth, started with a very small number of founders. And we call it a genetic bottleneck. So they've already gone through one genetic bottleneck, a pretty severe one with the founding. And then these killings every winter, and they vary from winter to winter, depending on how harsh the winter is, but that's a further bottleneck that you're putting the bison through, a selective factor that didn't exist in the wild. In other words, under wild conditions, the animals that migrated were the ones that are more likely to survive. Instead, you're killing those. And the same with the hunters outside of the park. They don't, native predators like wolves and bears pretty much can only capture like calves, bison calves, or really old and injured animals. Whereas the animals coming out of the park are just, all of them are getting shot. Doesn't matter. So you're taking away that selective process as well. And then you're also removing the animals. That's a lot of biomass that was removed from Yellowstone this winter. That biomass, would have supported grizzly bears coming out of hibernation or wolves or whatever. And because you're eliminating competition by killing so many animals, what the animals that would die naturally from these evolutionary processes. In other words, if you have a couple of thousand more bison in Yellowstone, they're going to compete more for forage. So some of them are going to die in the winter from, the cold. But if you kill 1,000 or so, then there's less competition. So they're not dying from that. And they're not providing the food to the other animals and scavengers that are there. So, and then there's evidence that the bison create a certain plant community effects in the park as well. And so that's another evolutionary factor. So you're not, where the bison are affecting the plant communities, but you're reducing that impact as well by removing so many bison from the park population. So all in all, the way management is going is tending to domesticate the bison herd, because the natural evolutionary processes are not allowed to operate as well as they would normally, or to maybe not at all.
So as I kind of said earlier, this sounds like a complete disconnect from ecology being practiced by the people in charge, who you would hope would have a connect. They're not thinking about the animals that would feed on the carcass of a dead bison. They're not thinking about the bison's effect on vegetation. They're not thinking about genetic depletion. They're not thinking about the fact, and interesting that you summarized in this way. These are the things that I wrote down in my notes. A big theme here is removing the wildness of the bison that remain And the ones that have the most wildness in them instinctively want to leave the park. They want to roam. They want to migrate, and they're being punished for it.
Right.
So, as you said, you're removing the ones that have the best uh, genetic pool, or you're removing from the genetic pool the ones that you would hope not to.
Right.
And you know, we're not going to be able to avoid this Native American topic. So all for woke society, who's automatically going to be offended that we're talking about this, this is about biology. This is not about culture. So no
Right.
matter what ethnic group we're talking about here, this is about whether or not it's good for the survival of the species. So please try to shelve your immediate instinctive reaction to just say that it's wrong to criticize this. You
Well,
mentioned that these tribal hunters,
mhm.
they slaughter entire family groups. You know, they're not
Right.
mimicking predators.
People have to understand that tribes that are there are not under the same regulations that say a regular hunter in Montana would be under. In other words, they can kill as many bison as they want. They can kill them throughout the year when they're available and outside of the park, as well as other wildlife, elk and pronghorn and bighorn sheep and so forth are also being killed. And so there's not the same, what you think about regular hunting by individuals for elk or whatever, those that hunting is at least regulated to some degree to try to avoid some of these problems that we're talking about. And I'm not going to defend it entirely, but the point is that the tribal hunters are not under the same restrictions, and you have to understand that. And the other part of it is, as I pose to people, if you were to say that, uh, we'll just say a typical Montana hunters had killed over 1,000 bison coming out of Yellowstone Park, I guarantee you there would be a big uproar over that slaughter that you would hear, and you would hear it from the conservation community as well, which is very silent on this whole thing when it comes to tribal hunting. So, that if you just look at it purely from an ecological evolutionary point of view, this is not good for the bison. And so you have all these groups that say that they're for protecting bison, and yet they won't speak out in opposition to this because of the sensitive nature, as it's seen, of having any criticism of tribal hunters. And that's unfortunate because the bison need advocates, and the advocates that would normally be there, and I don't want to name too many names, but almost every large national environmental group, as well as a lot of the regional large groups, are support they call it the treaty hunt. And that's another part of the whole equation. And I've done a whole lot of research on this, on the treaties. And these people need to read the treaties because actually, in my view, from reading the treaties and the legal decisions regarding them, no tribe has treaty rights to be killing bison near Yellowstone. They do have treaty rights to kill wildlife off reservations in specific locations, but not just any place they want to go to on public lands, if that makes any sense. The claim that they have treaty rights is questionable, and so that's the first thing. And so it may be all illegal. The second thing is the whole ecological question. Are we going to be looking out for humans, the anthropocentric viewpoint of saying, oh, well, the tribes have a right to kill bison, doesn't matter? Or are we going to say, well, what's good for the bison? And if you're going to take that biocentric perspective, then you should also be opposing the tribal hunt, as well as the state of Montana's, attempts to try to keep bison out of the state and so forth. All that deserves to be questioned because it's not good for the bison.
If people are coming from the mindset that I had at one point, you want to give credit to these tribal hunters that they come from a more connected background, and therefore their killing is actually a little bit more ecologically sound than, say, a modern Caucasian hunter or whoever we want to put at the opposite end of that spectrum. But if we're going to allow people to slaughter animals today based on culture, I think that the rest of the culture should come along. Where's the knowledge from the culture from the past about which animals to kill and not kill? Where's the self-enforced restraint of just because you're allowed to kill 1,000 bison, you realize, well, we're allowed to, but maybe we shouldn't. And I saw the pictures, it's not like they're out in tribal garments or using tribal weapons or camping out there. And, I get on obesity a lot because we as humans always declare ourselves as the superior species, but we are quickly physically going downhill. And this is carrying over to most of the images I'm seeing of Native Americans now, too. It's cherry picking. We're willing to pay attention to cultural background when it means sacrificing nature. But the rest of the time, it's like, you know what? We want your land for oil, so F you. But if you want to slaughter bison, we'll pretend that we have respect.
Well, the other thing is the argument that they're doing this for cultural reasons. I mean, you sort of hinted on this, but the tribal hunters are there with modern rifles, spotting scopes. They use drones to locate animals that might be hidden in a ravine. They're using pickup trucks to drag the carcasses to roads for processing, or ATVs in that case. And to be truthful, if it were, I would have a lot less objection, you might say, if the hunters were there with their own spears that they made, bows and arrows that they made, not using, rifles are a new thing. And another side point I have to mention is there's a lot of evidence, if you look at the historical record, that tribes contributed a great deal to the demise and extinction of bison. Bison numbers were being reduced throughout the Great Plains because once Indians got horses. And what happened is mounted humans on horses are like a new predator to the bison. In the past, before the pre-horse days, if you were to approach a bison herd, well, they could run away from you. People can't keep up with a bison herd running away. Like I said, mobility. So the opportunity to kill large numbers of animals, except at buffalo jumps, which are very unique, special situations that didn't happen very often, was pretty limited. And so if you were to, but once they got the horse, there were two things that happened. One, trading for horses became, sort of a big thing in terms of how you got status in a tribe as capturing horses and so forth, and how big your horse herd was. The other thing was you needed to get guns and ammo because intertribal warfare increased with the horse. And the main source of guns and ammo was trading posts. And what did the trading posts want to trade? They wanted buffalo hides. And so we have the record of how many bison were killed by tribal, different tribes over the years, because the traders kept pretty good records of it. And once they got the horse, it was basically not an equal fight, you might say, between the bison and the tribal hunters. So for example, by 1840, there were no bison left in northern Utah, eastern Idaho, western Wyoming, southwestern Montana. Most of the, a few stragglers here and there, but almost all the bison herds where just 10 or 20 years before, massive herds had been recorded, were gone. And the same by 1850, bison were gone from North Dakota, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and most of South Dakota. And so we saw this shrinkage happening of bison numbers. And then you got after the Civil War 1865, it ended. There were all these soldiers, particularly from the South, that didn't have jobs to go back to because the South had been so trashed. And a lot of them came out west and they started hunting bison in the 1870s when the railroads came through that could supply, carry the bison herds back east. But by that time, in a lot of places, bison were already extirpated. So it was sort of like the final nail in the coffin that on these herds that happened in the 1870s and early 1880s. And so by 1884, there were essentially no bison left in Montana. And it is an example. And it's remarkable because there was no settlement in Montana during that time. That's another thing people have to understand. There was some gold mining in the western part of the state, but out on the plains, you had Little Bighorn. You had various Sioux wars in the 1870s. Nobody was living out there in terms of white hunters. And so most of the decline, at least a lot of it, was happening. And this was noted even by the tribes. They knew this was happening as well. So you had this almost extinction of bison that occurred, except for a few stragglers here and there that were saved either on private ranches and or like in Yellowstone Park, where there was about 25 left that didn't get killed.
The evolutionary process was eliminated. As you said, the bison had no opportunity to adapt to the sudden arrival of the horse mount.
Right.
If this were a biological adaptation that took place over time, let's say that the wolf was developing some new skill, then the bison would develop a new skill in turn to try and keep some sort of a balance. This is just throwing something new on top of a system and throwing it completely out of whack.
To make an analogy in the human thing, it was just like most tribal people in North America didn't have a resistance to smallpox, but Europeans had some resistance. They still could get it, but they had some resistance because smallpox had been common in Europe and people had been exposed for it, and the people that didn't do well were eliminated. So that Europeans would still get smallpox, but it usually wouldn't kill them. But it would kill tribal people because they didn't have that time to adapt over, hundreds of years, thousands of years to at least have some resistance to smallpox.
I spent a lot of time in South Africa in my early conservation filming days. And when you talk about all the bison being slaughtered at the border of the park, I couldn't help but think about the big game hunters that fly all the way over to Africa and then lure lions and elephants and stuff outside of, say, Kruger or another park, and then kill them once they get them across. And
Right.
again, like you said earlier, if this was anyone else doing it, there would be an uproar. It's kind of gross.
Well, I've watched the the hunters there at the border of the park, and they do things like if the bison try to turn around and run back towards the park border, they have hunters waiting there to scare them and keep them from getting back into the park, where of course, the hunters are not allowed to shoot them. So, it's sort of that same situation that you're talking about. The bison move across, and then they're immediately targeted and surrounded and killed. And it's just even if you didn't have any sense of the ecological impacts of that, there's just a whole ethical issue here, I think, that is overlooked, and the same standards are not applied. Like I said, if it had been 50 Montana hunters out there surrounding bison and shooting a herd of 50 bison till the last one's dead, just once, if that happened, I know there would be an outrage.
A lot of people who have followed me in the past have followed my work with point rays, and they followed my shark work. So I want to draw some parallels. You mentioned the disease being used as an excuse not to allow the bison to expand. In Point Reyes National Seashore, Yoni's disease is used as an excuse to hold the elk and why not to let them outside. But in Point Reyes, that's a completely manufactured political BS excuse, because that disease came from the cattle.
Right.
At least in your example, did the disease originate with the wildlife, or did that also come from cattle?
That also came from cattle. So brucellosis infection, bison and elk, the origin of that brucellosis is from contact with cattle that had brucellosis. Remember, they didn't start trying to control brucellosis in the United States until about the 1930s. And back in 1900s, 1910, 20s and stuff, sometimes cattle and bison were fenced together in the same place, and they were able to pick up the disease. Now, the disease can be picked up by, say, licking a fetus that's aborted or some way like that. But other than that, here's another thing. Bison bulls and calves and yearlings can't transmit the disease to cattle because they don't They don't breed with cattle under normal situations. They can be forced to breed with cattle, but they don't normally. And yet we're killing
Wow.
all those animals. And then even among bison cows, most of them will reabsorb a fetus that has brucellosis and before they ever abort it. In other words, how would a cow get brucellosis from a bison? About the only way is if a cattle were grazing in a field where bison had been and had just aborted a bison calf that was full of brucellosis, and they came up to it and licked it or licked the grass around there, which was full of brucellosis. But the brucellosis bacteria is not going to survive very long outside of the animal's body. So you have to say, so what are the real chances of that happening? It's very slim. And then the other thing that's interesting that shows that this whole thing is a made up argument is that there have been 20, I think it's 28 instances of ranches around Greater Yellowstone that have gotten brucellosis. And in every instance, it was from elk. But we do not shoot the elk that come out of Yellowstone Park, just as a matter of fact that we're going to shoot every elk that tries to leave. They can wander all over the ecosystem. They get hunted during the hunter season and so forth, but there's no active effort to just keep elk in Yellowstone Park. And so to me, that demonstrates that this is not just about brucellosis.
Right. Not that I would want them killing the elk, but
right.
If you're going to pretend that the disease is a legitimate concern, then you would be killing those elk.
That's right. And the thing is that I think the real issue is that the bison and cattle have a pretty strong overlap in diet. And I think the fear of the cattle industry is that if bison were to come and be on other public lands like national forest or Bureau of Land Management lands where cattle grazing is permitted, there's a fear in the livestock industry that if push came to shove and you had, so many bison out there and so many cattle and there wasn't enough feed for both, that the public would want to see the cattle reduced, not the bison. And so they don't want to go there. That's a fight they don't want to get into. So the best way to do that is to keep bison from leaving Yellowstone Park.
And now we talk about Point Reyes again, because the people do want the elk there. They don't want the cattle there, but due to the political influence of the ranches, the cattle are winning anyway.
Right.
The elk in Point Reyes, for the people who don't know what's happening, are cold in multiple ways. They are passively killed through intentional conscious starvation of the animals behind a fence. So they meet what they call a carry capacity, even though it's not a natural carry capacity. And the population falls by nearly 50% sometimes. And outside of the park, they use the Johne's disease excuse to test and mortally test these animals. They don't mortally test any cattle, of course, except for when they're sent to slaughter. And everybody eats up that yummy Johne's disease meat that they don't have a problem with all of a sudden. But you talked about a genetic bottleneck. And whether we're talking about bison, whether we're talking about elk, whether we're talking about sharks, most of these animals have been hunted to such a low population that across that entire board, I just said, they're all starting from a genetic bottleneck. And we're continuing to slaughter heavily and unnaturally that same population.
Right.
So I feel like we're dooming the animals. Even if we didn't just shoot every single one of them, they're not going to be able to make it in the long run.
Right. Well, that's the thing. And you do this long enough and pretty soon the animals cannot survive on their own, like a lot of domestic animals, like, cattle. There are places where you have feral cattle in the U.S., but not very many places. And if you had regular predators and so forth, the grizzly bears and wolves, around the wild cattle, they would certainly be diminished greatly by the native predators without us protecting them.
And right. And the selection by the native predators would be more to nature's design, choosing the ones that should go rather than the ones that serve a human ego.
Right.
By mounting it on the wall or whatever.
Well, that's one of the things that it's an important thing for people to understand is that, yes, native predators kill whatever you want to talk about, elk or bison or whatever, some of them. And hunters kill some. And so one of the arguments with hunting is that, well, we have a certain percentage of the herd that's going to die every winter or whatever from, a harsh winter or drought or whatever. So if we kill, say, 30% of them, that 30% would have died from one of these other factors. So it's no harm done. The trouble is that the selective factors of hunters is usually not the same as native predators, as I mentioned earlier. The native predators consistently tend to take those that are most vulnerable, like calves or older animals or injured. Not that they can't get a what we would call a healthy animal once in a while under certain circumstances, but if you were looking at the odds and looking at your typical bison herd, the vulnerable animals are the ones that are the youngest, and that is not what hunters try to shoot. And including the tribal hunters, killing bison as they leave Yellowstone Park. So we've got an unnatural selective factor going on there with the hunting, the way it's conducted.
What about tribal hunters back in history when you didn't have a high-powered rifle and you didn't have a horse? Wouldn't they have acted more like a predator and chosen
Yes.
an easier target?
Exactly. They would have taken.
So
They
that's
would
just
have,
been
if
abandoned.
you imagine trying to crawl up on a bison herd, it could run away. But if there was an animal had a broken leg, then maybe you could crawl quick enough and close enough to kill it with a spear or a bow and arrow. So you're taking those same animals. And now, when they drove them over cliffs, which was a feature of where they would try to find a place where there's bison herd feeding on a plateau with a cliff at one edge, and they would try to drive them off the cliff. And, in those cases, hundreds of bison might get killed. But where the circumstances where that kind of situation lines up is pretty rare. I mean, I have no way to document this, but I'd say it's probably, once in every 10 or 20 years that some situation would line out like that for most, tribal people, that they would get a major kill like that. But they would take advantage of things like in the wintertime, if the snow is really deep, they might crawl up on snowshoes and be able to, kill a lot of animals. But it was more of, it was a real luck opportunity. It wasn't something that happened every year and in a long-term situation. Probably had a limited influence on the animals compared to things like wolves and bears.
Visually, it's so dramatic that most of us have seen a depiction of it, a painting or something. So in our minds, that happened a lot because it's one of the only things that we've seen. I remember seeing that as a kid,
Yeah,
and like the buffalo going off the cliff.
right.
So I knew nothing about it, but I remember seeing a picture of it.
Yeah, but once they got the horse, I've got a fair number of references of people that watched, where they might be able to kill 1,000 or 2,000 bison in one afternoon, surrounding them with the horse, and going in. And the interesting irony too is most of the time the Indians didn't use guns to shoot bison. They did it with bows and arrows and spears because they saved the guns for shooting other tribes. And that was a more limited resource. So
Point Reyes National Seashore has recently been trying to incorporate some tribes, Grattan Rancheria, while still giving the shaft to the Coast Miwok. But I can't help but wonder if this is going to be something similar, where now instead of it being the Park Service shooting the elk or the ranchers getting blamed, now the Native Americans are going to kill the elk, which is still going to accomplish the same goal that the ranchers wanted. And over there in Montana, like I said, the one cultural practice that Whitey is ready to embrace is killing off these bison, which, what do you know, is the goal that they wanted, not to have all these bison
well,
moving off into
you got it
cattle land.
right, exactly.
Did I go too far, or?
No, yeah, I think that's exactly what's happening. I think the ranchers are sitting back saying, "God, I'm so glad these tribal people are killing all these bison because otherwise we'd have to do it, and we know that we would get in a lot of trouble if we tried to do that." And talking about, I mentioned the treaty rights that nobody reads. all the decisions being made now by other federal agencies, whether it's the Park Service, the Forest Service, or whatever, goes back to an interpretation of the Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, who asked all the tribes to send them information of why they should be allowed to hunt in Montana. And the Fish, Wildlife, and Parks basically took all their assertions at face value without looking up to see if it were accurate interpretations of treaties or whatever. And that was very convenient because the state of Montana doesn't want to have bison come into the state, right? So it's convenient then if now you got the tribe saying we have a right to kill all the bison coming out of Yellowstone Park as much as we want, and you have the Montana Fish and Game saying, oh yeah, your treaty rights say that you can do that, although it's clear that they're not interpreting them properly. And then what happens if you go to the Forest Service or anybody else, they say, well, Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Park said that they have treaty rights to hunt here. And no conservation group has been willing to challenge the Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks interpretation because it deals with tribal people. And everybody says hands off. I've talked to a number of lawyers within Earth Justice and some of the other groups out there to try to see if I could get them to follow up with a lawsuit, and they're like, no way, we're not touching this. So the people that would normally, again, if there was a massive killing of 1,000 bison by anybody else, these conservation groups would probably be in court trying to stop it. But because it's being done by tribal people, they don't even mention it.
So for everybody who thinks that myself or George have been picking on Native Americans, what I've really touched on here is the ultimate manipulation by the man, often known as Whitey, now using this cultural sensitivity to his advantage again.
That is part of it, of course.
That's really what I want to point out here. As long as nature suffers, all of a sudden we're culturally sensitive.
I just cannot understand why there aren't more conservation groups calling this all out. I mean, it's a tragedy. It's a slaughter that is tolerated based on race. Actually, it's not based on science, and it's not looking at the ecological impacts of that. The removal, whether it's tribal people, whether it's agencies that test and slaughter, whether it's keeping the animals boxed up for a while and shown to be brucellosis free. In all these cases, you're adding an unnatural influence into the bison herd evolution. And I just think if you really are concerned about bison, you have to challenge the slaughter and say, what about these, the bison are public, I hate to use this term, public property, but I don't know how else to say. They belong to all Americans. And yet we're allowing a subset of Americans to basically have control over, whether it's the ranchers, whether it's the tribes, whether it's the other federal agencies that are not standing up for the public trust doctrine that they're supposed to be managing these animals for all citizens, not for any subset of citizens. And that's what I find disheartening is why are we allowing this to be done when we would not tolerate it if it was any other group? You want to make up subset,
The fear of being culturally insensitive is a big problem. Another problem here is the human disconnect from nature, or the inability to value nature just for being nature. Like, there were some people that I considered friends, or used to consider friends, and I would tell them about the Point Reyes situation, and a couple of them would be like, well, maybe if we figured out how to harvest them for meat, then the tule elk could be allowed to live. And I'm like, can we ever not make it about us? And I'm wondering if the only way bison are going to continue is if they are reduced to cattle, which I think really is what your publication kind of was pointing out.
Well, my thing is, the question you should ask is this in the best interest of the bison at any of these issues? Is test and slaughter in the best interest of the bison? No, it's not. Is the state's prohibition about having bison treated differently than any other animal. Even wolves can wander into Montana. Not that the livestock industry likes them, but they don't have people standing at the border of Yellowstone Park trying to shoot every wolf that might leave, for example, or grizzly bear. So we're treating bison different than any other animal by the state of Montana, and we're treating them differently with the tribal hunts as well. And so the question is that good for the bison? It's not good for the bison. And so it gets to the point that you were just making, that we are letting the cultural things supersede the biological considerations. And I just think us humans are, you'll hear the tribal members say, well, I want to feed my family. I got to shoot the bison, feed family. And they're driving around in brand new pickup trucks that cost, $60,000, $70,000. And you're telling me you have to kill bison here. And not only that, because they can still hunt elk and deer and so forth on other public lands and on their own reservations. So if you really have to hunt to feed your family, there's other options out there. Not killing the last wild bison, and that's a distinction. Yellowstone's bison are very rare because almost all bison herds in the country are intergrades with cattle. They're not managed as wild animals, and so we have to have a special consideration for Yellowstone bison.
Like I said, the people in the photographs look like they could skip a few meals, so let's not use hunger as the excuse. But, that's one of those things that we just automatically accept, even with other hunters. It's
Right.
like, well, I eat the animal. Well, I eat the animal. I'm like, okay, were you starving? We stopped thinking about the good of the continuation of the species of that animal when as soon as somebody says, well, I used what I killed. I'm like, oh, well, now you're an angel.
Right. No, I find that argument to be fictitious, not really for most people. When you consider how much they spend on guns and ammunition and travel and so forth, they could replace that game that they've killed. I probably shouldn't use the term game, but that animal that's been killed easily with other sources of protein. Now that gets into this whole rabbit's hole you can go down about what are the other sources of protein and how are they produced, and there's a lot of negative with that as well. But certainly in the United States, at least, people are not going to starve to death if they can't hunt.
Let's see. This could be just between you and me. I may edit this out for time, but let me say it just in case we use it. If you're interested, the shark examples that I was referring to, they cull sharks on the east coast of Australia heavily with beach nets and drum lines. And a biologist that was a friend of mine did a study and learned that they have killed tiger sharks to such an extent that that species is likely not going to recover. Great white sharks, an iconic animal in South Africa. A study came out saying that that species probably does not have a large enough gene pool for its ultimate survival. And actually right now they're missing from South Africa. And the real tragedy with the tiger shark is that the tiger shark isn't even the targeted animal, but the use of these nets and drum lines incorporates carcasses. So a tiger shark is meant to go around and clean the ocean. And therefore, when it comes to do its job and scavenge those carcasses, it is killed. Here we have the bison trying to improve their genetic pool by wandering and leaving Yellowstone, and they also end up being punished for doing that same thing.
Well, there's a thing to keep in mind. There's a lot of talk about co-management of parks and or even co-management of bison going around between tribal entities and various federal and state agencies. But you have to understand that the goals of the tribe in almost all cases are not the same as biological goals. I mean, you sort of hinted at it, but if, when you look at most tribal herds of bison, they're there so that the tribe can hunt the bison and get the meat and so forth. So they're being raised for human food production or cultural reasons, whatever justification is given, they're not, being allowed to sort of behave naturally to the greatest degree possible that would sustain the wildness of the animal. And I just think that that's a tragedy that's happening slowly, like we've learned that's happened in fish hatcheries, that we're doing the same thing to the bison by the way that they're being treated. And particularly, as I mentioned before, Yellowstone's bison are pretty unique because they have been the least manipulated. They haven't been totally dominant. When they were first trying to recover them, they fed them hay in the wintertime, things like that. But in general, Yellowstone's bison have been the least manipulated of the bison herds that exist in the U.S. today.
You mentioned that hatchery fish released into the wild actually hurt the environment that they go into.
Mm-hmm.
If we go back to the bison and we look at the most manipulated herds, is there evidence that they've lost enough of their instincts or anything that would be passed on genetically that they are now grazing or moving in a way that is more damaging than ones that are more genetically intact?
I don't think the evidence exists for that yet because it's been a gradual thing and who's done the comparisons?
Right.
For
Right.
example, here's another thing on where they have tribal and ranchers and others have herds of bison. There's a strong selection against aggressive bull bison because if you're out there as a cowboy trying to, hustle the bison across to another pasture or whatever. If you got a bull that's really aggressive, that's a problem. So those animals get eliminated. Well, those are the same animals that would be standing up to native predators. I have a fun story. I was watching a bison herd and some wolves in Yellowstone, and these three wolves were up on a ridge, and they were looking down on the bison herd, and then they started to trot slowly, and then they got faster and faster as they came down the hill, and they ran at the end really fast right into the middle of this bison herd. And they're standing there. You could tell they were nervous. They're kind of like jumping around on their legs and looking all around. And the bison, some of them just kept on laying down. And then one big bull gets up and starts ponderously walking towards these wolves. And they're like, hey, man, we're wolves. You're supposed to be afraid of us. And the bison keeps walking. And then they turned tail and with their tails between their legs and ran back up the hill. Okay, so if you're eliminating the bison bulls like that, you are eliminating one of the mechanisms that protects the herd. You want those aggressive bulls out there, and we are selecting against that kind of thing over time.
You also mentioned in your publication some of the things that would be lost with killing the older females, such as passing down where a safe place to give birth is or where to cross a river.
Exactly. There's we don't talk about this very much, but there's actually a cultural knowledge in wildlife that we need to preserve. You want to talk about protecting, tribal cultural activities. How about the cultural knowledge of the wildlife, which is tend to be the older females that are the keeper of the knowledge, so to speak, about where to migrate, where you can cross rivers, where's a safe place to calve, all that kind of where maybe the best food is in a harsh winter. That's all knowledge that's passed on, and we see it in other animals too, bears and elk and many other of the larger animals, and I'm sure it's a common thing in smaller animals as well. But the point being is that knowledge is being eliminated if you take all the older females out of the population, and especially the older females that are most likely to be mobile. I think that's one of the things that hasn't been discussed enough. I mean, there are scientists that have talked about this thing, the cultural knowledge of animals, knowledge of migration routes and so forth. But it doesn't get as much attention because it's, of course, a much more difficult thing to study and show in a study situation. So, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
Well, George, this was fascinating as usual. I almost forgot. So at the end of your publication, let's see if we can end this on a positive note. You mentioned the Montana wild bison restoration.
Yep.
Is that, and you give them your endorsement of actually trying to pursue something that is actually in the best interest of the bison?
Well, yeah, but I have to confess I'm on the board too. So, but yeah, um, but that group got started with a guy named Joe Gakowski and taken who's now passed away, and then started more so even by a guy named Jim Bailey who has written a lot about bison. He used to be a wildlife professor and retired, and he continued it, and he just died this last year. So we are trying to keep that whole idea alive, and the primary area of that discussion is to try to get Yellowstone bison more areas around Yellowstone Park where they're not killed, and then the other way to do that is to instead of just saying we're going to kill them at the boundary, if we are going to eliminate some from the ecosystem, let's put them on other public lands where they are where the land is a large enough landscape, like the Charles M. Russell Missouri Breaks area along the Missouri River in central Montana, and a few other places like the Red Desert, Green River area of Wyoming, all of which were actually at the height. They were some of the last best habitat for bison before they were extirpated over so much of the West. And we could restore them there. And, at some point, you might have bison getting shot. But if they were roaming over 3 or 4 million acres and they had more than just 1,000 animals or so, in other words, where you could have, like in Yellowstone, just get back to my point there, if we had it so that bison were tolerated in all the roadless areas and other places surrounding Yellowstone, you could easily support a herd of 10,000 animals. Well, at that point, the problems of genetics would be greatly reduced. They wouldn't be zero, but you're going to have a larger population where that is not going to have the same significance and the same impact as a smaller number of animals. So I would say that what we're trying to do is advocate for creating more bison herds on public lands where there's suitable habitat.
You would think that that would be fully embraced because there's a lot of lip service out there about, oh my God, we're losing our native wildlife. And then there's even references to the importance of the effect of native grazers. Yet, for the most part, I just see animals being driven off the land for the sake of livestock expansion. Maybe that's cynical, but that's what I feel like is happening.
That's the problem with all these places I just mentioned. Almost all of them have livestock raising, and that's where something like the voluntary permit retirement can come in handy, because if you could convince enough ranchers to sell their grazing privileges, you eliminate that conflict. And to the degree that you have fewer ranchers objecting to the transfer and establishment of bison herds, then that makes it easier to have that happen.
Anything important that I missed or that you'd like to say?
Well, I guess the main thing is to reemphasize that, at least in my view, there is no treaty quote rights or privileges to be killing bison outside of Yellowstone Park. And I'm being specific because this is the confusion. There are treaty privileges to hunt off of reservations in other parts of the West that the tribes do hold. But as far as I can tell, no tribe has that privilege written into any treaty that would apply to the area around Yellowstone Park. So I think that's an important distinction, and one that needs to be explored more. And gosh, if there's any lawyers out there that want to work with us to try to file a lawsuit based on that, I'm happy to talk to them.
Cool. Well, thank you for your attention to detail on that. And thank you for joining me again today. And I'm sure all the listeners thank you as well. And until next time, George, have a good one.
Thank you.